Hi, welcome. What was the relationship between the Scottish Highlands and the Caribbean with regards to slavery, slave wealth, and colonization? If you've been a part of the Sankofa Pan-African series, you will know by now that our focus is to confront global systemic racism by challenging the myriad of negative narratives out there about Africa, Africans, and the African diaspora. We are, of course, not the only people trying to do this. Now, in order for us to effectively confront racism, it is important for us not just to educate ourselves, but carry the rest of the world along with us as well. We must find a way, to educate others about us and get them to also know what we're doing and partner with us. That is why the works of our allies are important. The naive position to take when it comes to issues of race and racism is to see the world in form of compartments made up of people of different races, all black people on one side, all white people on another side, and then brown people in another compartment. And that is the kind of thinking that got us into the mess the world is in today. And we know that there are people of color who are out there destroying other people of color. In the same vein, there are some non-Africans who have stepped out of their privileged positions and comfort zones to speak out against racism and the oppression of others. My guest today is someone who has dedicated time and energy. He has been working as an ally by investing a lot of time in unearthing the connection between slavery, slave wealth, and the Scottish Highlands, with a view towards seeing that reparations are made. Before meeting him, please click on your subscription and notification buttons. Thank you. David Alston studied at the universities of Aberdeen, Oxford, and Newcastle. He has worked as a teacher, consultant, and founder-curator of Cromarty Courthouse Museum, among several other engagements. Welcome, David Alston. Thank you very much, David, for being a part of the Sankofa Pan-African series. It's always nice to have allies like you to share some of the wealth of your knowledge. So thank you for agreeing.
It's kind of you to say so, and it's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
So I know you've put a lot of time and energy into studying the connections between slavery, slave wealth, the Scottish Highlands, and the Caribbean. So we're going to talk a bit more about that today. But what got you into this line of work in the first instance? How did you get interested in pursuing this line?
It was almost completely an accident. I live in the north of Scotland. I live in a small community called Cromarty, and I was interested in the history of my own town. And this is about 25 years ago. And I began to notice some connections with Guyana, with Demerara and Berbice, which was part of Guyana. And the more that I looked, the more that I found. And to be quite honest, I'd heard of Demerara. I couldn't have told you where it was. And I'd never heard of Berbice. So I began from almost complete ignorance. And what I discovered was, as the years went by, the enormous extent of the involvement of people from this part of the north of Scotland in the slave plantations of Guyana. And from there, this was at a time when really Scotland as a whole was paying no attention at all to its involvement with the African slave trade and with the plantations of the Caribbean and South America. And the more I looked, the more I found, and I expanded my interest to look at other of the former British colonies in the Caribbean. And I think the overall picture you get is that, and this is now well established, that in proportion to the population of Scotland, when you compare it with the population of the United Kingdom as a whole, Scotland was disproportionately highly involved with the slave plantations and received more in compensation for slaveholders at the end of slavery than did England, for example. Wow. And one of the things I've only recently come across, if you look at Guyana in 1841, which is after the end of slavery, and you look at the white British-born population, there are more Scots born than English born in Guyana at that point.
Wow.
And I think that's just a reflection of what's been going on.
That's an eye-opener for me, because like you said, we've all heard of Demerara sugar, but I don't think many of us actually stopped to think that it actually refers to a place, where this world-renowned sugar, was grown. And honestly, when we're talking about slave trade and all of that, automatically your mind goes to England, because England was the dominant country of the trade that make up the UK. Hardly do you think about Scotland or Irish or Welsh, connection with the slave trade. So what was the relationship between the Scottish Highlands and the Caribbean?
Well, Scotland united with England in 1707, and up until that point, the colonies were English colonies. They called them the English Sugar Islands, Barbados and Jamaica. But after 1707, the door is open for Scots, as part of this new entity called Great Britain, to become involved in these colonies. There are a few Scots there before, but basically that's when the door opens. And what plantation owners need is people on the ground. Lots of plantation owners become absentee. They make their money and they manage from a distance. And there were advantages to that, because they could then keep their influence in Parliament. They could lobby against abolition of the African slave trade. But they needed reliable people on the ground. And I think there's a bundle of reasons why Scots get involved. The main one is to make money. We can't get away from, that's what this is about. So people are seizing these opportunities. Scotland was always proud of its education system. So I think there's an element that there was a considerable number of people who were reasonably well educated, and running a plantation, you needed bookkeepers and managers. It wasn't something that you could just hand over to somebody who didn't have the necessary skills. And running plantations, particularly the big sugar plantations, it's bigger than running factories. They're huge enterprises. So it needs these accounting skills, these managerial skills, and so Scots filled that gap. But the other thing, and I think it's perhaps in some ways the most disturbing point, is that slavery relied on brutality. You needed people who were prepared to terrorize other people. And perhaps people on the margins, people who've been in military service, that Scots tradition of military service that went back for centuries. War brutalizes people. So, at least some of the people who ended up in the plantations are people who had experience that made them prepared to inflict that brutality on others. So it's not a comfortable picture, but I think that's roughly an explanation of why Scots become so involved. And we know about England because the financial centres are there, and and all of the slave trade and the slave plantations rely on financial systems. So a lot of it does centre in London. But Scots are very much involved.
From my take is that, so they probably started out being hired at first by the English, who were the maybe initial owners of the colony plantations. But then they now grew to become, more influential owners of plantations.
Yes, and that's certainly true.
Making money out of the plantations with which they
that's particularly true of Barbados, but then Britain gains more colonies, takes colonies from France, so the ceded islands, as they were called, Grenada, Tobago, and these create new opportunities where new land from the perspective of British plantation owners is becoming available, and there's a real rush of Scots to seize these opportunities. So, and some of these colonies are particularly Scottish. Tobago is very much Scots who become involved there. So each time there's that new opportunities, Scots are even more involved, and the final phase of that is the acquisition of Trinidad and of what had been the Dutch colonies of Essequibo, Demerara and Berbice, which eventually becomes British Guyana and then Guyana. So for each of these, you can see more and more Scots becoming involved.
So how was the wealth which was acquired in the Caribbean used to develop Scotland? Can you give us some examples?
It happens in a number of ways. I mean, it used to develop Scottish industry. So the industrial revolution in Scotland is based on cotton, and obviously the cotton itself is coming from the slave plantations of the Caribbean. And in that period, in the 1700s, that it is Scotland's very reliant on the Caribbean, particularly after the American Revolution. So cotton is important. There's also an important export market because the Scottish linen industry, one of the things it was making was what they called slave cloth, which was clothing for enslaved people. So a lot of enslaved people would have been dressed in a rough linen cloth that was manufactured in Scotland. There's also the export of salt herring because you need to provide people with a minimal amount of protein, and the sources of that protein, the cheapest sources were Scottish salt herring and salt cod from Canada, from Nova Scotia. Yeah. So you have these trades. But when the money comes back, it's a lot of it's being reinvested. The people who make money come back. They could make quite extraordinary amounts of money, and that's then reinvested in land ownership, in the display of wealth, in art, in culture of various kinds. So you can look at major art collections that are funded on profits that have been made in slavery. You can look at lots of large houses that are built with the money that's been made.
Wow! And those houses are still there.
Oh yes, very much. Yes, yeah. I mean, it's quite from where I am just now. I can look out over a piece of water to a hill with a monument on the top of it. Now the monument is Indian inspired, but it's built in imitation of the gates of an Indian city, because the owner of the land there had made his money with the East India Company and with the armies in India. The hill is called Firish. There's a plantation Firish in Berbice in Guyana. It's close to a village called Eventon, where every street when that village was built was named after a plantation in Grenada or Tobago. So it's a real imperial landscape in a rural part of the Highlands, and I think it reflects not just the involvement with the African slave trade, with the slave plantations of the Caribbean and South America, but with India as well.
And so apart from those structures, that remind us, of this sad era, and that the gains, of this era continues. I mean, there are families which still benefit from the gains of slave trade, slave wealth, and all of that. I've also heard you talk about the connection between the slave trade and the current financial system, like banking, the way the financial systems in the world currently work.
Yeah. This is more complicated, but I think it's very important. Both the slave trade itself, both the African slave trade and the running of plantations required sophisticated systems of credit, because people were both transporting people across the world and transporting goods across the world in the triangular trade. You could only do that if you could rely on credit. So these credit systems, these financial systems, were developed first of all to service the African slave trade and the slave plantations, and that gave Britain in particular a great advantage. These systems were made possible by the power of the British Navy, which was protecting these trade routes, trade both in people and in goods. So one of the big impacts or the legacies of slavery was the way in which Britain had developed its financial systems, which were then able to provide the financial support and the credit systems which enabled other forms of industrial development within Britain, and after the end of slavery within other colonies, linking them back to the home country. So London in particular obviously grows as an important financial centre. And the historian Eric Williams is still important because of the way in which he first of all demonstrated in the 1940s just that the way in which slavery had pervaded British systems, including the financial systems, and how you couldn't just think of the benefits which had accrued in terms of the profits from the plantations, the profits from the slave trade. It was a whole system which developed on the back of enslaved people.
So the old banking system were also set up are gains of the slave trade.
Yes, I think that's true. Yes,
so
yes,
yeah.
Yes, and yes. And then, of course, when at the end of British colonial slavery, we have the vast amount of compensation paid to slaveholders. So there's a major transfer of public funds to private hands.
I know.
20 million.
I recently interviewed Dr. Afua Cooper, who actually traced. She's a professor at Dalhousie University here in Canada, who was able to trace, those kinds of monies that were got by individuals who, as compensation for giving up their slaves, and the way in which that money ended up not just only building most of Nova Scotia, large cities like Halifax and so on, but also universities. One of the major universities in Canada is the Dalhousie University, and the money from with which that university was set up has been directly traced back to the slave trade. And as a result of her study, the study she did with a group of others, the university has now started trying to make some reparations, like providing scholarships for Black students and setting up Black studies and all of that. So are there those kinds of relationships that you can also trace between?
Yes, so you'd find these across the UK. There is an extent, obviously, to which you can relate this to individuals and to families. But I think what's perhaps more important is the way in which it funds the whole development of infrastructure, the educational infrastructure, railways, the shipping. So it's difficult. So in many ways, if we're looking at reparations, they're very much communal responsibilities. I mean, it's nations as a whole which have benefited, not just sections of society. And I think one of the other things that the recent research has shown is the way in which slave ownership had permeated society. I think it used to be thought that the compensation was about a few individuals who owned very large numbers of enslaved people, but actually very ordinary people owned slaves. And going back to the financial systems, I mean, other people were developing financial systems. The Netherlands was particularly innovative in its financial systems. And it had created sort of consolidated financial systems where groups of people could buy plantations, almost just like the way people now would have money invested in their pensions.
Yeah.
People in the Netherlands in the 1800s would have money invested in financial instruments which were linked to plantation ownership. So asking the question who benefited from slavery it's a bit like asking who benefits from oil. Yes, there are some people who benefit enormously from oil, but there are also lots of people who benefit in lots of ways. Some of them quite small, and I think that's the insidiousness of the whole system, is the way in which it seeps through the whole of society, and people are almost entangled in it, whether they like it or not.
So, which brings me to the question, so why should we insist on pursuing, this kind of history?
Well, from my perspective, very much being, as a white person in Scotland, I think it's important that Scots pursue this history simply because it is part of our history, and it's part of a history that it's quite difficult to find the right term to describe it. I think it's been silenced. I mean, people sometimes say people have forgotten, or I think it's more than that. I think that it's been an inconvenient truth that doesn't sit with the narrative that we have wanted to tell about ourselves. And until we get that right, we won't have a proper view of our own history, a grown-up view of our own history. So it's important for us to get it right. I think it's also really important that we see the way in which our history is entangled with the histories of so many other places in a very intimate way. I mean, that is both with the countries of Africa and the countries of the Caribbean and South America. And I think we need to understand this as a shared heritage that brings with it shared responsibilities and shared opportunities.
And to also see that just as your societies continue to enjoy, the proceeds of this, horrible era in history, these places in the Caribbean, in Africa, continue to suffer.
Yes.
As a result of it.
Yes.
It is not by accident that when you compare, say, a country like Guyana, to even just that part of Scotland, the Scottish Highlands, the differences in terms of standard of living, the economic opportunities available to citizens, they're miles apart.
Yes. Yes.
And so this idea of looking at aid, as some form of charity, there are things there that we need to rethink. It's not.
We
aid.
do. Yes.
It's not aid. It's a debt. It's
yes.
Debt that must be paid. If not in terms of actually putting the money there physically, at least finding ways to even the playing fields. Children who are born there, also have, the ability to aspire to become fully actualized, to be able to fully actualize their potentials. Just like children in Scotland take it for granted, that they will have the opportunity to actualize themselves.
Yeah. One of the things I've been involved in recently, along with a colleague, Donald Morrison, and we're just about to launch our own campaign about this, is that we discovered that there's a charitable trust in Scotland called the Dick Bequest, which was set up by a man called James Dick, who made his money in Kingston in Jamaica, along with Robert Milliken. Now, some people will have heard of Robert Milliken because his statue stood outside the Museum of London until last year, when the museum decided to remove it. So James Dick is Milliken's partner. When he died, he left most of his money to establish a trust which would pay the salaries of schoolmasters, and they were all men, schoolmasters in the rural parishes of the northeast of Scotland. And the money which he left, it's about £130,000 at the time, and that money was the interest from that money was enough to match the salaries of more than 130 schoolmasters in rural parts of Scotland. Now, if you imagine if that money had gone to Jamaica, and it first started paying out money in 1833,
where the money was made.
Yeah, where the money was made. What a difference that could have made. So our argument is, we now know where this money came from. That money should go back to Jamaica, and for the future, the income from that money should be benefiting children in Kingston, where James Dick made his money. I don't know where we'll get with that, but we're going to try. But that's maybe an example of there are discussions which national governments need to get into about reparations. There are, but there are also individual organisations, and I think some individuals will themselves think, I, as a member of this family, have benefited from slavery, so there may be obligations on me. But there are also things about communities. I said that I live in a small community called Cromarty. There was a Cromarty plantation in Berbice in Guyana. There's still a community called Cromarty, and there are about 20 other place names from my immediate neighbourhood which are replicated in Guyana. So we have that very close connection. And last year in Cromarty, we started a little project. We managed to raise £4,000 to help refurbish the kitchen in the Scots church in New Amsterdam in Berbice in Guyana. That will enable them to take part in a programme of providing free school lunches for some of the children in New Amsterdam. Now they're doing that. We're not coming in and doing it for them, but we're providing something that will enable them to do it. And they just completed the kitchen refurbishment last week. That's I think another example of where trying to do something community to community is a way of doing it. And Scots have always been very keen on creating links with the Scottish diaspora of white Scots descendants in Australia or New Zealand or Canada. But there's something else that can be done with that other diaspora, which is linked to the slave ownership, to the slave plantations, and where so many people, if they're not descended from Scots, they still carry Scots names.
I know.
They're Scots names.
All over Nigeria. Yes. You have, names starting with Mark all over, the African diaspora. So what you're saying is that reparations, yes, should be going on at national levels, but there are things that individuals, and communities, who have benefited from slavery, slave wealth, colonization, can do if they are actually well-meaning, and
yes. I recently came across the phrase "just generosity." And maybe it's quite difficult to find the right language for this, because I think in terms of at national level, I think reparations is the right terms. For communities, it's maybe individuals in these communities don't don't have an individual responsibility for what happened in the past, but together we have a communal responsibility. So I think it's also about not making it into aid. It's not about charity in that sense. It is about trying to forge a new relationship.
It is sickening how dependent African countries, Caribbean countries, a lot of the African diaspora are dependent on aid, even for the most basic things, when this should never have been the case. The wealth from these areas have been used, to develop so many other parts of the world. And even if we put aside the idea of aid, there is even the issue of the fact that even today, there's problem of trading. The global trade is so warped, that the economic colonization continues to be perpetrated. Yes. There's also that, that, okay, you have refused to pay back what you took from us and all of that. But at least let's have a fighting chance at commercializing the resources that are left. That's also a problem which well-meaning individuals, on all sides should get involved with.
Yes.
What other forms do you think reparations can take?
There's a very good example that I've seen of the National Archives of the Netherlands, who have worked with the National Archives of Guyana. Formerly, the Netherlands was a Dutch colony till 1815, although they actually lost control of it in 1796. The National Archives of the Netherlands have worked with the National Archives of Guyana to conserve, digitize, and make freely available everything in the National Archives of Guyana up to 1815. So that resource is now freely available to anybody, wherever they are, if they've got access to internet, to understand that history. And I think one of the things that we should be doing is placing an obligation on our national institutions for that shared heritage. And again, not as a minor part of what they do, and they do some important work through the help with conservation of endangered archives, but saying it is a priority that we make this, the archives which relate to our colonial history and their involvement with slavery freely available. There is something particularly important about Guyana, because Guyana is a small country. Sure. It often gets neglected when we're looking at history. But when you look at the compensation that was paid to the slaveholders, it wasn't a flat rate across all of the colonies. It related to the economic value of enslaved people in each of these colonies. Just over £6 million went to slaveholders in Jamaica, just over £4 million to slaveholders in Guyana. So together, that's more than half of the amount that was paid out. But in Jamaica, the amount of compensation paid was less than £20 for each enslaved person.
Wow.
In Guyana, it was £50.
Whoa.
So what that tells you is that's where the money was still being made, because that's where enslaved people still had that high economic value. And that's to do, in some ways, with a whole history of environmental degradation, because as the plantation as sugar growing had moved through the colonies, it was an environmental disaster as well as a human disaster. And the importance of Guyana was that this was new ground that could still be exploited. So this is where fortunes are still being made. It's where the big sugar houses, the sugar merchants, where they're involved. And therefore, at the end of slavery, it's where there's the greatest interest in ensuring that there is a continuing supply of labour. The other colony that's like that is Trinidad. So that's where there is the greatest interest in bringing indentured labourers from India to replace. And I say to replace because what they discovered was that those who had been in slavery, had been forced to work on slave plantations, basically didn't want to carry on working on plantations. They wanted to work on the land, they wanted small holdings, and they were happy to do some plantation work, but they weren't prepared to be, in general, full-time workers on sugar plantations. And so there's the experiment in 1838 in bringing indentured labourers to Guyana, and these are the first indentured Indian labourers brought to the Caribbean. Now, the majority population in Guyana is of Indian descent rather than African descent, so you can see the impact of that. And just to illustrate some of the surprising connections, Cromarty, where I live, is about 800 people. There is a house here called Barclay House, which belonged to merchants called the Barclays, Aeneas Barclay and his son Henry Barclay. They owned 2 plantations in Berbice, and they were part of that first experiment of bringing indentured Indian labourers. And that partnership. They were in partnership with people called Davidson. So Davidson's and Barclay, as a partnership, were the partnership which received the largest amount of compensation.
Wow.
In 1834.
So
and their influence.
Compensation was to bring people from India. Is that
that's one of the yeah.
So not compensation for owning
for slavery.
They brought in indentured workers from India.
But what they used it for was to invest in equipment, to reduce the size of the labour force, and to bring indentured labourers from India.
Wow, that's just so sick. It's terrible. It's terrible. Thanks for sharing that. Thank you very much, David, for being a part of the Sankofa Pan-African series, and for all the work you do and the commitment, you have to, seeing that at least the history does not remain hidden, and that some level of responsibility is taken for actions of the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bunmi. Thank you.
Thank you very much for watching this episode of the Sankofa Pan-African series. Please give us a thumbs up and share this video with your contacts. Also, please share with us on our community page what you have done today to help change the negative narratives about Africa, Africans, and the African diaspora. See you next time.